Hi everybody, my name is Ryan Ike and I am the composer for a game called Where the Water Tastes Like Wine, which, if you're not familiar, is a game about exploring this kind of folktale version of America during the Great Depression and trading and sharing stories with all the various kind of fantastical characters that you run into. It came out about a year ago as of the time of this video, and because we're coming up on the 1-year anniversary and we're also kind of up for a bunch of Best of 2018 awards right now, which is pretty neat, we thought it'd be kind of cool to kind of take a look back at it and maybe answer some questions that have come up from fans of the game and the soundtrack. So yeah, let's get into it. Alright, so the first one that I get a lot. You were asked to write a soundtrack that represented all of America as a whole. What was your initial reaction and how did you approach this? So that's a really good question. My initial reaction was screaming and pooping, which is sort of my go-to thing when someone asks me to do something that sounds completely impossible and way out of my depth. I'll just be on the Skype call with a dev and be like, oh my god, yeah, totally I can do that. I'm from America, are you kidding? Oh, the whole country? No, that's fine. That's all of it. Okay, yeah, I can do, and then click, and then I just kind of work it out on the job, which is a big secret of the game audio community as an industry. Game audio professionals, this is kind of a thing that we do, is say, yeah, I can handle that. Can't handle it sometimes, and then we just figure it out on the job. So sorry to blow up your spot, rest of the audio community, but that's sort of a thing that we do. Once I was done having a Chipotle style complete panic meltdown, I decided to start just sort of breaking things down a little bit. The game is mostly set during the Great Depression, so I knew we were going to want to use a lot of folk music from that time. So like old school bluegrass and country and blues and jazz, all of these iconic American styles that were really starting to come together and interact with each other around this time. Then it was just a matter of taking a few weeks to kind of listen to as much of this stuff as I could. So I went through a ton of Woody Guthrie and Duke Ellington and Joni Mitchell. Anyone who either made music during this time or sort of built on the music from this time later. Immersing myself in as much music from this time period as I could was really important in kind of getting me in the right headspace to not have a complete meltdown trying to write this thing. The other half of the equation of getting the sound right and kind of making this soundtrack be representative of an entire country during this time, or as much of a country as we could manage anyway, was hiring the right people. So part of what makes music from this time period sound the way it does is that it comes from this really authentic place. This was music about hardship, written and performed by people who lived through that hardship. So if I was going to make it sound genuine, I needed to work with performers who understood the styles that I was asking of them and maybe came from these backgrounds that these characters come from. So one of the aspects of the soundtrack that makes me the proudest is how diverse the musicians are. I worked with players and singers from all over the country and from tons of different backgrounds to put together this album that hopefully sounds as varied and original as the country it's supposed to represent. How did you get involved with this project? I trapped someone in a coffee shop and screamed at them until they gave me a job. Kind of. So I was a big fan of a game called Gone Home, and I learned that Jonathan Nordeggen, who was the lead developer, was going to be breaking off and starting his own studio. I also found out that he was going to be going to PAX, the Penny Arcade Expo, if you're not familiar. It's a big game convention. They happen all over the country and one in Australia, but there's one in Seattle right here in my backyard every year. And Jonathan was going to be there. So I did something completely terrifying to me, which was I reached out to someone who didn't know who I was and had no reason to know or care who I was, and asked them if they wanted to hang out. And he said yes, which was surprising. And more surprising, I didn't wake up in a bathtub with all of my bone marrow missing. We just had a really nice conversation about games and audio and stuff and folk tales and music and Seattle. And then later, he asked me to score the trailer for the game. And bone marrow still intact, I did that. And that was kind of my entry point into working on this project. Okay, so this is actually one question that I get a lot, which is how did you get started in game audio? This is not my first game by far, but it's sort of a related question since we're talking about game music anyway. How did I get into it and how do other people get into it? So I'm going to actually be doing a more in-depth series of videos on these down the line, but for now, I literally saw a tweet about a developer asking people to write music for gameplay. My dog is currently humping the bed. But ship it, you know? It's 2019. We've seen it. You guys are an enlightened crowd. This is fine. Whatever, you know? I'm not here to yuck any yums. Anyway, I literally saw a tweet from a developer asking people to write music for a gameplay video that he posted, and I submitted and got the job. And I know that's very unsatisfying and it sounds completely random, but typically when you ask people who work in game audio how they got their first gig, it kind of always sounds random and unsatisfying. And that's because when you're trying to work in games, there's rarely a spot where you submit a resume or you go through a traditional job interview. It happens. But typically, getting work in the game industry, and specifically in game audio, is almost entirely about making friends. So my main advice to people who want to get started in games is to take every opportunity you can to find people who make games, whether they're designers or programmers or fellow audio people or artists, whether you think they're in a position to hire you or not. Just try to hang out with them and make friends. This can be through a Facebook group or at an IGDA-sponsored event. It can be at one of the huge national conventions like PAX or GDC. It can be at local meetups. It can be at a game jam. There's tons of places to do it. But basically anywhere devs are hanging out, anywhere people who make games are gathering, that's where you want to go, and then just try to be your cool self and meet people. And I know that sounds horrifying. I would much rather be at home with a bag of Cool Ranch Doritos over my head than ever outside of my house, basically. Let alone at a packed meetup with a bunch of people who I don't know. But I promise you, as someone who has been through this myself, it gets easier. Networking and meeting people is a skill, just like anything else. And if you keep at it and you just kind of steel yourself for these awkward moments you're going to have, because you're going to have them, it's fine. And you just kind of push through it. If you keep coming back and keep trying to meet people, you will get better at it. It will get easier. That's the main thing. Just make buddies, and eventually those buddies hire you to do stuff. Can you talk about some of the different cultures that are represented in the music of Where the Water Tastes Like Wine? How did you approach writing for cultures that weren't your own? So I'm not sure how high fidelity video technology has gotten here in 2019. I think we're on 8K by now. I'm not exactly sure. I'm not really a videophile. So my point is, I don't know if YouTube is high def enough yet for you to note that I'm white as hell. And a lot of the people and characters represented in Where the Water Tastes Like Wine are not. Specifically because the developers set out to kind of make a game that featured a lot of stories that don't normally get featured in video games or in a lot of media in general. Every character in the game, and there are many, has their own theme, and for each one I spent weeks listening to as much music that represented their background and culture as I possibly could. But even more important, wherever possible, I tried to hire performers to play that music who represented and understood that character's background. So, for example, one of the characters is a Navajo lady named Dahaya, and her whole story is about how she was forced, along with the rest of her people, to leave her lands and live on this reservation. And then in the game, she takes this kind of pilgrimage to go back to the land that was taken from her and see what's become of it. So I really wanted to do a traditional Navajo piece of music for her. But look at me. I don't know how to do that. So I reached out to a Navajo composer named Michael Begay, who not only played traditional flute on the track and did it absolutely wonderfully. The entire track is pretty much just him really laying into it, and it's wonderful. But he was a really great advisor and kind of guide through the whole process. He walked me through how to get the rhythms right so they fit in with what's typical of Navajo music. He even went so far as to speak to a tribe elder on our behalf and kind of double check to make sure that the performance practices were okay and that we were doing the stylistic stuff correctly so that it was really as authentic a piece of Native American music as we could make in this situation. It made something much more genuine and kind of culturally fitting than I could have produced if I just tried to do it on my own. What part did history play in the score and the game in general? Did you get to work with instruments from a past time period? Did you use any techniques from this time period? So history played a pretty big part in this whole soundtrack, actually. A large part of that is the fact that the game is mostly set in the Great Depression. It's doing a little bit of a amorphous, Doctor Who, timey-wimey type of thing. So there are characters in the game that are from as late as the 1960s, but most of it's set in the Great Depression. And for each character's theme, I really looked into what music was like in their time and their part of the country. So what were the musical trends? What instruments did people have access to? Did people tune their guitars a certain way or choose certain percussion instruments over others? What styles of music were the most prevalent and why were they so popular? What did they mean to people in this time and place? I didn't want to just make music that sounded like each character based on what they said or what they looked like. I wanted it to come from this hopefully authentic place based on what time period they're from and where they're from and what music meant to people like this character back then. So it was definitely the most research I've ever done for a game score. You know, I went to a physical library where they have like the book, like the real books, like you touch them. So, you know, where's my parade, I guess is what I'm asking. What was something that surprised you about working on this score? So there were a few things, actually. One was the fact that I can write lyrics, sort of. Aside from a few lines for a couple of tracks when I was in a band in high school, I've never really done it before. And it was a challenge that I don't get to face very often because a lot of game music, and especially the scores I've worked on, don't really have lyrics at all. There's not opportunity to do that. So it was really satisfying to finally have an excuse to take a swing at it, and you know, I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. Another kind of welcome surprise was realizing just how much a single live performer can change a track. I've known for a while that one vocalist or a single live instrument can really elevate a piece of music, even if everything else in the song is synthetic, but I don't think I realized just how much this was true until working on this game. The album uses more live instruments than any game soundtrack I've ever released. And that counts acoustic stuff, electronic stuff, or otherwise. And when you hear the difference between the mock-up versions that I made initially, which were all sampled and synthetic instruments, and then the finals with Joshua kind of shredding on guitar or Kenya just belting out these insane vocals, it sounds completely different. And I'm definitely going to remember that going forward. Okay, so I'm sorry that my dog is having a sexual awakening during this whole thing, so I appreciate you all for sticking it out. It's indie games, you know? We're all freewheeling here. We kind of just take it as it comes. If you want to check out the game, just simply search Where the Water Tastes Like Wine on Steam. We're available there. The soundtrack is on Spotify, iTunes, all the usual places where you find music of basically any kind, and you can also find it on Bandcamp at waterwinemusic.com. And stay tuned here for more stuff from me and my fellow musicians on the soundtrack as we kind of take a look back at this thing that we made a year ago that we think is really cool. And if you haven't checked it out yet, you know, consider giving it a shot. Maybe you'll think it's cool too. Cheers for now. Bye.